So there's been some couple of interesting question and interest on what is the state of open source? How do we get more Africans to participate on open source projects, to be open source maintainer, or to look for ways to kind of localize content that will bring more interest from the continent? Yes, it's not a country, it's a continent with over 50 countries, and I don't speak African. Actually, I'm from a country that have over 500 languages. Yes, I speak English. So the aim of this conversation is to basically show the African commitment towards open source and to introduce the uniqueness of being an African in open source, and to also demonstrate the collaborative effort, given the recent report from GitHub showing how, Africa has been growing really big. So, so I'll ask you this question, Sonia. Do you want to tell us more about yourself and introduce yourself to the?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Sonia John. I'm a bot and protocol developer. I'm also the head of tech at Afrolynk. It's a German-based company that is focused on impact building for startups. And I'm glad to be here today.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So David, you want to take over from here?
Yeah, hi, and welcome to the panel. My name is David Lemayian. I'm CTO at Code for Africa. We're the continent's largest civic tech organization. Essentially, we build technologies and help innovations across journalism, government, CSOs, and we try to do that across the continent. Thanks.
Look good?
Cool. Hi, everybody. My name is Lunga Mthembu. I'm a software developer at an organization called OpenUp. So our goal at OpenUp is so essentially we are an open data organization that we try to help citizens understand data so that they can make decisions about their communities and even work with government as well.
Okay, so a little bit about me. My name is Samson Goddy. Oversight board for a project called Sugar Labs. If you're familiar with the one laptop per child, give one, get one for free project. And I'm also help building a community called Open Source Community Africa, which we're also trying to advocate more in the open source continent. So speaking about open source, Sonia, do you want to tell us how did you get into open source? Was it scary for you at first?
Well, I think for me, I got into open source by mistake. I mean, I just kind of bumped into it. Because actually it starts off with the story of how I became a programmer. I learned to code out of necessity, so to speak, because when hyperinflation hit my country, I'm from South Sudan, and when hyperinflation got into my country, I think our currency was devalued by, say, 1,000%. I no longer had a job. I had to find something to do. And out of necessity, I learned to code. I taught myself how to program. And I think one time I was using a tool to build an application that I was working on, and I noticed a bug. So I decided, hey, I can point this out, to the maintainers. Hey, I noticed this bug, can I fix it? And the feedback was not so good, but that was kind of my first interaction with it, and I realized all the things that I had to do around open source contributing, and that was pretty much my journey.
So what was it towards the code side, or like documentation, or like basically trying to build a community?
So it was more of a bug fix request, because I noticed I could run the program on my side and it was not working because there was something that needed to be fixed. And when I made that recommendation, I think I had not followed the right steps in open source contributing, because it turns out, there was all this contributing to open source guidelines that I had never interacted with. And that was pretty much how I ended up learning about this whole industry.
So you got into open source by mistake.
Yeah. And it's been a fun ride since then. So I've been learning about all different kinds of policies, maintainer policies, and yeah. So
David, you run Code for Africa, and what kind of drive that idea? It's basically you have interest, or you're a programmer, right? Yeah. And you're building a community. So do you want to tell us more about Code for Africa? What is Code for Africa? For people, I'm just, for me here,
That's
kind of like tell it to like as if I'm a 5-year-old, like
you don't know. It's interesting. Do I run Code 5? No, definitely not. I
Okay.
think we're a lot of us.
Okay.
We currently have staff in like 8 countries across the continent. We have organizations that are part of the network in 22 other countries. There are 54 countries on the continent. And we see ourselves as an ecosystem builder, almost like an impact accelerator, where we look to seed ideas into the continent using leapfrog technologies, essentially taking what's working in other countries and making it as a solution here. I mean, as Sonia said, it's sort of, you get into open source sometimes by mistake, and then sometimes you are looking to solve some solutions locally that have been solved by other people across the globe. So what we figured out is we, as Code for Africa, are able to use some of these technologies developed, and simple technologies that have been developed all over. Everything from air quality sensors, drones, and even small things like SMS solutions that we then also contribute to the open source community and try and replicate it across the continent.
That sounds really interesting. It sounds like, do you even sleep?
I try to sleep a few hours, but I mean, when you're working with teams from Mexico and South America,
the time zone.
It's really good.
So, Lunga, do you want to share your experience? How did you get into open source? Or by mistake, or?
It was also kind of from a necessity. Is that okay? Let me say, Windows Vista made me work on Linux, but I was having trouble with the operating system, so I said I need to find something else I can use. That's how I got into Linux. But when I got into it, I didn't really know anything about the Linux and open source community. And one of the first problems I had after installing it was that I didn't have any wireless internet. So I had to dig around the documentation to find out how can I actually get my wireless driver to work. And that's how I met other developers saying, hey, try this program, it doesn't work for you, write this code, send it to us, and we'll see whether they can fix or not. And that was my real first introduction. So I was kind of forced to know what was going on so that I can actually get my Wi-Fi driver to work. So that was how I got started. Yeah.
So David, let's come back to, or let's go back to Africa, right? When it comes to open source, the word open source, there's this, focused on developers. And in Africa, there's a lot of interest, especially like towards the social good side. So, how do you think that open source can kind of enhance opportunities for journalists? People that kind of not really into the whole technical side.
Yeah.
Do you think there's an opportunity on that side, towards the open source movement?
I think the way you've said it is sort of like the non-technical teams, outside of the developer space,
Yeah.
so even outside the normal social for good change space. My mother last week was like, David, what are you, or Lemayian, that's what she calls me. Lemayian, what is this open source thing, right? What does open source mean? And she was telling me, enjoy yourself at the GitHub, so that's how she puts it. But the idea of expanding, sort of the opportunity and the access to open source, we have found is important to the ecosystem. We're working with much smaller budgets than most other continents. If you think about America, the GDP, all of this. So open source sort of reduces that barrier for access to technology, access to solutions, right? If you can't pay a massive licensing fee, you essentially can be able to spend that money in paying other developers, being able to pay for journalism, being able to pay for the kind of activists or the kind of government officials that you need on the ground to do the job. So for us, we see as open source reducing that barrier, but also reducing that cost for people to be able to get access to this technology to do the work, to engage with citizens.
Now, you did mention something about cost, which I want to, I know you're big into money. So, we're in San Francisco, right? And the technical jobs here, based on the cost of living of this, the city, tends to go really, really high, right? Now, back in Africa, how do you think, so I come from a country where about 60 to 70% of the population are under the age of 30, right? And within that number, most of the engineers, software engineers are currently in university or doing something that is not work related, like working in the industry. And coming from a country that 70% of the GDP focused on crude, petroleum, not like technology. How do you get to compensate, or try to sell open source to somebody that is struggling in university trying to pay all the bills? How do you think companies or organizations should look for ways to compensate these engineers to build software, just as David mentioned, towards building things for social good?
No, I think that's a great question. And the way I can summarize it is we're trying to find ways to motivate implementers of free software development on the continent to actually increase free software development and adoption. And before we can even discuss how to restructure the motivation itself, we need to find out what actually drives developers to open source. What makes someone decide, hey, look, I want to contribute to building this free software? It's very different in the case of proprietary software development because you have almost an instant gratification for the work that you do. So a company hires you, they tell you, hey, can you build this software for us, and this is how much we're going to pay you. So it's almost instant gratification. While in the case of free software development, we have to deal with a lot of deferred rewards for the work that you do. So maybe you fix a bug, you build a feature, you build the entire infrastructure, and you can only get rewards for what you do much later. I think one of the ways that we can flip that motivation and reward system for Africa is maybe say, look, let's focus on some of the key players or stakeholders, some of what I focus on is working with proprietary software builders. This is companies that hire developers. And what we try to do is we try to get them to build software that is mixed. So it's half of it can be open source and another half of it can be closed. I can give you a brief example of something that we did earlier this year with a popular insurance company. Is we got them to build a model for simple insurance-based payments on mobile. And what we did is we got them to make the entire infrastructure open source and only get them to pay contributors for customizing the solution when they want to sell it. That way, you can attract more contributors to work on the closed source part of it, but they can also contribute on the open source part of it.
I think that's a very brilliant idea. And now, speaking about money and sustainability in Africa, so I part of stuff I do when I'm not coding, I do some work for the community. There's this thing called the African Girls Can Code. Towards the nonprofit side, I serve as a contractor for the United Nations, building a culture where we train African girls on technology, which obviously do a lot of things around nonprofit. So, just 6 months ago, I was in Addis Ababa, and we obviously they wanted us to teach the girls on coding, but then was looking for a way not to spend a lot of money on software. And well, the funny thing is, I can easily just tell them, oh, I can teach them basic Git and GitHub, right? How to do version control, how to go to W3 school, reference HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now, towards the nonprofit side and towards the NGO side, how do you think leveraging open source as a main tool can help save a lot of money, like in terms of like cost? Because like she mentioned, our government tend to spend a lot of money on licensing, and as an NGO, right, not everybody have that huge reserve of money as the government. So what's your thought around that?
So I think in general what happens is that most NGOs, they don't really know about open source software. They know about the commercial space because it's the safe choice. So when we approach NGOs, we try and just tell them about, hey, there is an alternative solution to this commercial product. And at the same time as well, you also be saving a lot of money, and you will get maintainers. So one of the biggest fears is that this is an open source product. It's not no one is responsible for it. But then once we actually go through the process as to what open source is, how it works, what the maintainers are, then they actually start seeing that actually this is a valuable thing, and that this is something that can last us for a couple of years. And then we don't really have to depend on anybody. We don't have to depend on a particular company. We can depend on other developers who are interested in what we are doing as well. So the NGOs are more receptive to that, but the government is still a bit finicky, that they still want commercial products with a vendor. So we're trying to get into the space where we're trying to tell government that open source is not a scary beast. It's something that is maintainable and sustainable as well.
Now, let's talk. We've talked about money. We've talked about community and ecosystem. We've talked about saving money as an NGO. But now let's come back to the actual contribution. I know in the South there's a lot of open source maintainers waiting to hear how to build the next billion creators. Mm-hmm. Now, speaking about advocacy, right? There's been the recent report from the Octoverse, stating how, countries, like Nigeria, Kenya, and Morocco, I think some couple of countries on the northern side of Africa, has been growing really, really well. What do you think is driving this force? I know you're from South Africa, South Sudan, and also in Kenya. Kenya is also very big in terms of like development space. So what do you think is driving this force? Because if you're looking, compared to other continents like North America or in Europe or Asia, just like what I mentioned, right? Most of these engineers are students. They don't work for Google or Facebook or GitHub or Microsoft, and not everybody get that opportunity to get paid to work for open source. So what do you think is driving that force of actual contributions? Do you think there's an advocacy vibe going on in Africa?
Contributors. I like what you said, alternative to proprietary software.
Yeah.
One of the things that we are finding as well, and how Lunga said it, is that a lot of governments, a lot of commercial entities, and even bigger organizations that are more established are most worried about maintainability. And I think that's one of the things that we're finding is that cost of maintainability or maintenance being reduced by taking up open source software. And we feel that therefore, and this is why we feel that we need to build an ecosystem, because we need to close those skills gaps, right? And by closing those skills gaps is by being able to give people access to code, access to software, and building that ecosystem such that more people are able to maintain this code, more people are able to contribute and be able to even be hired within the government institutions, within the NGOs, within even the corporates to be able to make this code available. And so for us, I think what's driving that change, what's driving that uptake is that people are being able to see that with this gap, when you close this skill gap, you're able to actually reduce your cost of maintenance and your cost of development and even adoption of some of the latest technologies.
Sonia, since you were more focused around money, do you have any comments yet?
No, I mean, I'm glad that he mentioned closing the skills gap because, like I mentioned, some of the work that we do at Afrolynk, working with startups, is building the tech developer pipeline as well. And the way that we do that is by working with developers at every level where they come, beginners, intermediate, or even experts. And the startups or the companies that we choose to work with in our impact acceleration programs, what we tend to do is we try to make sure that at least 50% of the startups that we work with are building free software or open source software so that developers who then get placed into these companies or startups, as interns or placed there for mentorship or placed there even for jobs, get the opportunity to work or contribute to open source. And I think if we get more organizations doing something like this, then we can see the increase in open source contribution to not just maybe increasing by 40%, maybe even 50 or 60% in the next few years.
Okay. Lunga, how is the open source community, particularly in South Africa?
I think the community is not as big as Nigeria and Kenya, but I think we're starting to see open source starting to take hold in South Africa, because we've created a community branch, a community version of our organization, and what we found is that people are actually starting to come to these meetups, and they actually want to start working on projects, because one of our goals is to we've got three ways to use an organization. We've got inform, empower, and activate. So inform people that something like this exists. Empower means that they can actually do something about it, and to activate means that they can start engaging with government. So once we go through all those steps with them, they can see that, oh, this is a useful thing, and we've got the tools to actually start working with government. Let's start working on projects. So that's how and what we've seen, especially this year, is that our community has grown more and more and more, because we're starting to say that, hey guys, we've got these cool projects that people are starting to work on. Do you want to come and contribute? It's open source. You don't have to be a developer, because I think sometimes we focus too much on the tech, but in some cases, even a designer can come and actually make a good contribution to a project.
Yeah.
So we try not to exclude. So we try not to only talk to developers, we try to talk to people from different industries as well. Because we're starting to get lawyers coming to our meetups as well. They want to see whether other tools that they use to improve their law process. So having that thing that, hey, there's an open source product that you can use, or an open source meetup, you can actually start seeing what's going on.
Interesting, because you mentioned about, like I said, one of the challenges of defining open source to a newbie or a newcomer is this you need to be a software engineer, you need to write code in order to contribute to open source, which what we do at the Open Source Community Africa, which I co-founded last year actually, is to actually drive this huge ecosystem of having designers, content creators, people that can actually see how they could build some business model out of some open source project. And I think it's kind of like based on how personally I got into open source. I got access to the One Paper Child project a couple of years back. I started using the tool, the computer, and I got interested in how things work, because I like breaking things. And so I think I kind of like got my way around the OS, learned Python, created a game, blah, 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 and now became a maintainer for that organization. And as a maintainer for a project that is focused on education, and then in terms of like age range between 8 to 16, it's kind of like, difficult, right, to explain how just to put it into context, we every year through projects like the Google Summer of Code and Google Coding, we receive lots of young people in the community. My job is to help mentor, to make sure they actually follow code of conduct and not fight around. The thing is, even back in Africa, right? If you want to host, or if you're doing an open source focused event, you always get engineers or people writing code, and then when you ask the designers, hey, why are you guys not there? It's like, is it free or is it not free? How much are you paying me? That's kind of vibe, right? And it's almost difficult to explain to a designer that pays from the computer to the tool to licensing, compared to the actual engineering where literally you can just go copy and paste some code to spend your time on Stack Overflow. So this has been the challenges of, trying to build it. Well, it's not actually like, building diversity into open source, welcoming, I don't want to use the word non-technical, but bringing designers and, content creators, and, because anybody can write code. Let's just be real, right? So how do you think should be the interest? Because mind you, there's a lot of open source maintainers here that might particularly focus on this topic. How do you get to welcome people that don't write code as a day job or a day as designers? Yeah. So what is like the selling point? What do you think we should focus on?
I think one of the first things that you should focus on is interest. Like, do they have interest in a particular field or industry that they're looking for? So
It's a tough one, right?
Yeah. So usually what we starting to see is that we'll get say a journalist who will come to us and ask us, hey, I'm interested in finding out whether what's going on with evictions in my town, but I don't know where to start I don't know where to start in that process. So immediately we know that we can see that, okay, this is not a technical person, but let's tell them what is available. Let's help them go through the process, and then from there they can start seeing that, oh, actually I can build a product without necessarily knowing how to code. So we're also starting to remove the word technical or code or hackathon, because that immediately excludes different people. So for hackathons especially, we always combine technical people with non-technical people, so that we as developers can gain a different perspective as to how to think about a problem, and then once people can see that I can make a difference, even though I can make a difference to a project, even though I'm not technical, that'll give them motivation to actually come back and continue working on more projects.
No, okay, I think that's a very good question. Now back to advocacy. Some weeks back, I was at the Open Source Summit, and somebody asked me one interesting question. Like, hey, Samson, I noticed, I have, in my community, I have a lot of, Africans contribute to open source, but for some reason they don't apply to speak at global conferences. And I was like, should I tell him? Like, remember, I was like, should I really go into, should I actually explain the problem, or should I just, kind of shy away from it? Because obviously we should be 5 here, right? And somebody got, some visa issue. And so what do you think? Well, I'm going to come back to what I'll just leave the open source festival at the end of the talk. But what do you think, for global conferences, like for example, GitHub Universe, yes, contributing to open source is one, setting meetups is two, but then meeting people, getting to talk to people is really awesome. Networking is great, but the real problem here is issues of visas. How do you think we can tackle that problem? Is it by bringing conferences down to Africa, or what do you think is the problem in order to solve that? Because, of course, advocacy is a thing. You need to go there, talk about what you do in Africa, but then there's that big brother, which is visa. You always, like the first time I got my US visa in 2017, I spent roughly 15 minutes explaining to the officer why I need a visa, which is crazy. So, so what's your thought around that? I don't know, Sonia, do you have comment on that?
Well, not on the visa issue, but no, I like the point that you brought up about maybe bringing conferences or people who are interested in open source to developers or people interested in the free software industry to the continent. And I think there's a lot of ways that people can do that. Personally, I'm excited about the announcements that GitHub made yesterday at the keynote about GitHub for mobile and GitHub sponsorship. I think those two things combined with maybe voice to text is going to change how developers interact, with open source, because I don't know about the statistics about internet connectivity just yet, but I know that almost every African has a mobile device, and if they can now use GitHub on their mobile device, I think it can improve the way that they contribute or even create repositories, etc. And maybe the sponsorship program will encourage more people, to contribute, because then they can see, okay, maybe there is a reward for the work that I do. And for independent developers or maintainers who are interested in working with developers, maybe as mentorship, there's lots of organizations on the continent, even in Europe, in Africa, that are creating peer-to-peer mentorship opportunities, right? So if you can find some of these organizations and maybe try to sign up or even offer yourself to be a mentor to some of these people, it will maybe go a long way to improving the way open source is run, the free software industry.